we are going to start off with longtime friend of the community, Darren Barefoot. Darren, let's talk.
Thank you. Have we started yet? So I was gonna.
You're in.
I had an anecdote about a dentist appointment I had today, but it's
all
okay.
right.
No, it's okay.
3, 2, 1, you're on.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, Eli. So there's this aphorism, which some of you may have heard about advertising. It's this old thing people say about advertising, which is they say, I know my advertising works, I just don't know which half of it does, right? Which is this like common thing that before the advent of the internet, one spent a lot of one spent a lot of time guessing at what might work or wouldn't work in terms of advertising. Of course, the advent of digital advertising and digital marketing has like radically changed that. So I'm going to talk about hyper-targeting. Eli asked me to talk about hyper-targeting, and to do that, I want to tell you a story. I run this small agency called Capulet, and we've been working for the past 6 months on a national environmental law reform campaign. And there's lots of moving parts to this campaign. But there's government relations, there's media relations, lots of different pieces. But I want to tell you about 2 forms of advertising we happen to do. One form was like classic bus shelter ads. The objective of this campaign was make sure that basically the Liberal federal government is committed to reform 4 important environmental laws, and we want to get those reforms to be as strong and as progressive and as aligned with what the coalition we represent wants. And so we did these bus shelter ads, which were very kind of positive ads on this group of 7 theme because they had these 7 federal ministers in them, and they were positioned right around Parliament in Ottawa, right? Such that we had somebody who works for us in Ottawa walk around and look at the best bus shelters around the location. We bought ad space on those. And the intent here was very specific, actually, to target the staff, and I suppose the leaders themselves, but the staff of these 7 key cabinet ministers who might see these ads and be reminded that these groups are paying attention and want the best outcomes, okay? And so that ran, and there's ongoing government relations, and we heard 1 or 2 mentions of it through the kind of grapevine on the Hill, but really no sense of how effective those were. Conversely, in this same campaign, the coalition identified 17 key constituencies, 17 key ridings across the country that they wanted to be sure those MPs from those ridings heard from their members, right? We have this mechanism where you would go to a site, you would customize a letter and send that letter to your MP. And there were these 17 MPs, they were on committees, they were some of these cabinet ministers, they were key and important people. And so in that case, we kind of put hyper-targeting to work, or what is commonly called hyper-targeting. Sidebar, hyper-targeting is actually a term invented by the creators of MySpace about 10 years ago. Talk to me after the show because I saw a MySpace URL on the back of a car yesterday for a band that didn't, I looked them up. They disappeared 12 years ago, but this guy had his car still. Anyway, sorry. So MySpace invented this for their ad platform, right? Which is at first it was about targeting like 15 different interest groups, like, I sell skis, you like skiing, I'm gonna advertise to you, right? And that was the kind of gestation or start of it. So the hyper-targeting we did, let me ask this question first. Has anybody done Facebook ads where they need to advertise the particular ridings or constituencies? Right. And it's a terrible process to identify the geographical details of those ridings, isn't it? Unless somebody has a better solution. I talked to my colleagues, you may have a better solution? Okay, I'd be curious to hear that, because I talked to my colleagues at the BC-NDP, my friends, and they were like, no, you need to manually draw out or map out each individual riding. So that was the first step of hyper-targeting, was we actually said, okay, Edmonton Wood Mills is a riding, and so we need to target that riding, and then you look at the riding map, and then you look at the Facebook map, and you try to calculate which postal codes or which radiuses from a given point will give you approximately the right riding. So that was step 1, was the location. And then, we engaged in a bunch of subsequent steps many of you in the room probably have done. We did a bunch of testing and optimization around gender, around age. We found that women over the age of 35 were likeliest to complete the action we wanted to take in those ridings. So that's what we ended up with doing. Then we did this thing, which is a trick, but it's a pretty common trick, I think. Lena was saying that she does it. So We, you can do all sorts of behavioral and interest targeting inside of Facebook, of course. And I've learned over time, and others have told me, that the best way to do this is to target people who have an interest in other groups like your group, right? And so for this particular one, which is environmental law reform, not the sexiest cause, even in the environmental space, as you might, like, oh, we'd like you to write a letter about the Navigation Protections Act. And people aren't super excited about that. So we targeted the following groups. I just copied and pasted them here for the sake of completeness. The Nature Conservancy, Earth First, Greenpeace, Green Party of Canada, WWF, Sierra Club, National Resource Defense Council, Oceana, WWF for Nature, Wildlife Conservation Society, on from there, like another 15 or 20. This is a common trick, right? People know this trick, so I'm seeing some nods. And so this was hyper-targeting, and to use the example of...
Why is it a trick?
Well, it's just kind of a little bit sneaky. I think it might be slightly unethical to target groups. It used to be more literal because, like, you say you had liked WWF, and then subsequently I could target you, even though I was David Suzuki Foundation. I am not casting aspersions on either of those groups, by the way.
I did that very thing.
Yeah, you did, back when Eli worked at DSF. So that's why it always feels slightly sketchy. Like you're kind of like, could you get me a date with your friend kind of situation, you know what I mean? So yeah. So in the case of Edmonton Wood Mills, one of these 17 ridings, we actually whittled the target number of people down to 2,000 people, right? Which is a tiny group of people to advertise to, but that's what we found was most effective. And so that's essentially hyper-targeting in a nutshell. And I'm talking a lot about Facebook because for, I think, most of us here and most of our, like, certainly our Canadian clients, that's where you experience hyper-targeting most often. Large for-profit corporations are doing terrifying things with big data where they're buying data from Facebook and buying data from many other data sources, Amazon, behavioral data, survey results, census records, combining that in terrifying ways. And I'd be curious to hear about afterwards if there's anybody doing that level of kind of sophisticated big data hyper-targeting in Canada in the nonprofit sector, but I'm unaware of it. I do want to say there are a couple of other ways. You're giving me a 3-minute warning, thank you. We're just signaling.
Very subtle.
Yeah. There are other ways outside of Facebook that groups can still do hyper-targeting with. The classic one is, let's target people who visited the donation page for more than 5 seconds but didn't donate, and they meet other criteria of your donors, right? So you build a profile of your current donors. Maybe they're women over 35 in Edmonton, but they may have other characteristics like, they visited your website a certain number of times, they're from particular regions, right? A classic strategy here is targeting people in wealthy neighborhoods, right? In your city or in your province or across the country. It's very common. Interesting side note, Americans get actually access to a lot more filtering inside Facebook. In the States, you can target, for example, based on people's salary, right? Which is not a thing I think you can do in Canada, as far as I know. Twitter you can too. I don't trust the Twitter data at all. No, it's like total BS. And so, in short, essentially, hyper-targeting is this. It's this identifying, drilling down, targeting people basically based on 2 large buckets of information. The one is information that's self-expressed, info that people give to Facebook, give to Google, give to you as a nonprofit, right? This is my age, this is my gender, this is my physical address and space. And then it's combined with a much larger bucket, which is typically user behavior, right? That's what links I click on, what videos I view, what interests I have, what pages of your website I go to and for how long, what actions I take on behalf of your organization, and so on and so forth. So taking those 2 things and then trying to narrow that audience down as much as possible to, the rule of thumb would be the smallest group possible that's still worthwhile to advertise to, right? Like Facebook typically says that's 1,000 people, sets that threshold around 1,000 people. It might be smaller or bigger depending on what channels or what marketing activities you're doing. And I did want to, that's the promise of hyper-targeting and it works a lot, but I did want to, finish with this second part of the story about this environmental law reform campaign, which was, so we were targeting 17 ridings, and they were all Liberal or NDP, but a number of them were, what would you say? They were bluish liberal, liberal. They were small c conservative liberal ridings. And so we did this hyper-targeting, and we ran these ads. But inevitably, in a number of these ridings, particularly for the ads which mentioned climate, we would get like grumpy old men who would comment negatively on our ads, even though we'd aspired to do this hyper-targeting. And I did quite a bit of research and asking around, and I never do. You were nodding. You've seen this too. Yeah. And it's like it's fascinating to me that Facebook has not like optimized that process so that I give it all these signals, but it still gives false results back to me when people who are, kind of unhappy to hear about, addressing climate change, for example, and get quite fussy about that. And so that is the kind of, I guess that's kind of a downer note to end on. But anyway, I think, we're headed in this direction. Eventually we're going to get to an audience of one, but it is not without its problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.